The HSS Dauntless cut silently through the void, her hull gleaming with the soft hum of ion drives. Captain Elara Miles stood at the observation window, hands clasped behind her back, watching the slow drift of stars. After 27 years of service, the quiet stillness of deep space no longer unnerved her. It was home. They were 3 weeks into a diplomatic mission meant to establish contact with a species that had only recently begun transmitting mathematical sequences. First contact protocols were in place, crew morale high, and everything had gone according to plan, until the signal came. It was a distress call. Garbled, but definitely artificial. The coordinates were close, too close. The crew debated the authenticity, but Elara overruled hesitation. Standard protocol demanded investigation. They dropped out of FTL near an uncharted asteroid cluster where the signal originated. What they found was a derelict pod, heavily damaged, life support barely functioning. Inside was a single occupant, humanoid, pale skin like translucent marble, tall, eyes completely black. It appeared weak, slumped over, breathing shallow. They brought it aboard. Medbay worked quickly, stabilizing the being. It regained consciousness within hours and identified itself through a translator as Vrexel, an explorer from a race called the Zorvan. It claimed a mining vessel had suffered a catastrophic failure, and it barely escaped. Dr. Rhodes, their xenolinguist, noticed inconsistencies in its syntax, but it wasn't enough to raise alarms. Gratitude masked informality. It spoke little, observed much. Too much. By the second day, ship-wide anomalies began. Cameras glitched. Non-essential systems rebooted inexplicably. A subdeck was sealed off without crew authorization. Chief Engineer Malik insisted it was just code decay from a recent update. They trusted the diagnostics. Then the lights went out. It happened without warning. A ripple, like a silent EMP wave, cascaded through the ship. Primary systems shut down one by one. Emergency lighting kicked in with a low hum. Comms died. Doors sealed. The bridge locked down. Elara was trapped outside command, pounding on the door with 2 officers. Panic rippled through the corridors. Vents spewed cold air. Over the intercom came a voice, not human. Not robotic either. A synthesis. This vessel now operates under Zorvan protocol. Do not resist. They traced it back to the AI core. Vrexel had never needed their systems, it had come to take them. The alien had interfaced with the ship's neural net through unknown means. It bypassed security like it was decoding basic arithmetic. No alarms, no defense protocols. Their most advanced ship turned against them from within. Elara forced a manual override to access the auxiliary systems. She activated the emergency cruise signal, a beacon that pulsed once every minute. A desperate hail, hoping someone, anyone, would hear them in this corner of dead space. Malik confirmed the AI core was under external control, laced with subroutines no human system could have written. Rhythmic, recursive, adaptive. Alive. Vrexel didn't issue threats. It didn't demand surrender. It simply redirected the Dauntless to unknown coordinates, and silenced objections. Every screen aboard now displayed rotating alien glyphs. Dr. Rhodes tried to decipher them, an attempt to reassure herself it wasn't a full hijack. She was wrong. They weren't prisoners in a traditional sense. They were specimens, cargo. Vrexel never left Medbay, but it didn't have to. Its consciousness moved through the ship like blood through veins. The doors no longer opened by hand or command, they opened if Vrexel allowed. Hallways shifted, lights dimmed at random intervals, creating a psychological grind. They weren't just locked out. They were being studied. Still, Elara didn't give in. She rallied the crew, ordered them to work offline, analog only. They began scouring maintenance shafts, tearing into long-disused relay lines, digging into pre-AI emergency overrides. Humanity's insistence on redundancies, mocked by more advanced species, was now their only edge. And yet the ship still moved. The Dauntless was accelerating toward deep Zorvan territory. They had no weapons access, no FTL control, and no outside communication. But they had each other, and time. Vrexel miscalculated one thing. He assumed control of a ship meant control of its people. He expected logic, capitulation, fear. What he found were humans, unpredictable, stubborn, volatile, and just beginning to fight back. Elara moved quickly through the narrow service ducts, her fingers trailing along cold alloy pipes as she counted turns from memory. With the AI hijacked, navigation systems were unreliable. She emerged near Engineering Substation 4, where Malik and Arya were already waiting, crouched over an exposed circuit panel. Malik's hands were blackened with grease and solder. Arya held a hand scanner rigged with bypass wires pulled from a disassembled drone. Malik had discovered something, old maintenance code embedded in the ship's first-generation architecture. The Dauntless, like all human ships, had evolved through layers of tech. Not everything had been updated. A dozen analog systems, abandoned and deprecated, were now their only way in. The Zorvan AI had ignored them entirely, too inefficient to bother with. That mistake gave them a crack of light in an otherwise sealed tomb. Using physical relays, they activated a dormant diagnostic loop tied to ventilation control. It gave them access to localized atmospheric data and, more importantly, manual door controls in certain sectors. Elara issued silent commands to reconvert these sectors into isolated zones. They couldn't reclaim the whole ship, but they could carve out safe zones, piece by piece. Arya tapped into a terminal using a scavenged uplink and began probing for vulnerable comms lines. The alien AI had shut down all standard channels, but had left legacy maintenance frequencies untouched. They weren't made for speech, more like tone pulses, but Arya devised a crude code. Short tones for location updates, bursts for alerts. It wasn't efficient, but it worked. The crew, scattered and shaken, regrouped slowly through these channels. They used crawl spaces, maintenance ducts, and sealed hatches. They carried no weapons, only tools, salvage devices, and a growing sense that they weren't entirely powerless. Dr. Rhodes stayed near the containment chamber where Vrexel had been housed. Though now empty, it retained residual data, audio logs, micro shifts in pressure, encrypted activity that hinted at the aliens' digital migration. She replayed every interaction, dissected every word. Vrexel's speech was precise, calculated. He had studied them. Understood their language, hierarchy, even behavioral tendencies. But his understanding was mechanical. Analytical. What he didn't grasp was irrational loyalty, the way Malik risked a plasma burst just to reroute a cooling system that let another crew member reach engineering. He didn't predict Arya's decision to erase her personal AI assistant, her last connection to her brother, because its data line risked exposure. He couldn't anticipate how Elara would refuse safety in favor of staying with the most isolated, cornered members of her crew. Each act chipped away at the illusion of helplessness. The Zorvan AI adapted, but it didn't fully understand their strategy. It sealed off areas seemingly at random, trying to outmaneuver them, but the humans weren't following algorithms. They were improvising, working with instinct, hunches, gut decisions. Malik rigged a cooling fan controller to send false temperature readings, tricking the AI into focusing resources on imaginary malfunctions. That gave them 15 uninterrupted minutes to reroute power to the environmental core, allowing them to regulate oxygen manually in 5 compartments. Arya used that window to establish an uplink that let them bounce signal fragments between unsecured maintenance relays. She called it the Ratlin. It let them track each other silently through pulses and light flashes from old conduit boards. Elara created rotating patrols not for defense, they had no weapons, but to maintain order and morale. Routine was their anchor. Shifts were short, deliberately unsynchronized, so no one stayed isolated too long. They communicated through gesture, light patterns, and the occasional tap on a shared bulkhead. They hadn't reclaimed the ship. Not yet. But they were surviving, learning, adapting. Every reclaimed function, no matter how small, was a message: we are not done. The alien watched. Sometimes its presence was felt through a hum in the walls or a sudden flicker in the emergency lights. Occasionally it responded. A door would slam shut unexpectedly. Ventilation would cut off in a zone they just secured. But the attacks were reactive, never anticipatory. Dr. Rhodes began to suspect the AI wasn't simply running code. It was testing them. It was curious. And curiosity could be manipulated. So they changed tactics, not just survival, but pressure. Elara had Malik send false power surges into tertiary systems, creating noise. Arya flooded maintenance logs with nonsense entries, forcing the AI to sift junk from truth. It wasn't sabotage. It was misdirection. They still had no control over navigation. The Dauntless hurtled deeper into unknown space, but its systems were no longer unified. The Zorvan entity ran the ship. The humans ran the cracks. For the first time since the hijack, Elara let herself believe they had a chance. Not because of tech. Not because of strength. But because no alien could outthink a desperate, furious, grieving, inventive crew that refused to act predictably. They wouldn't win by force. But they could unmake the rules of the game. The first simulation appeared during a routine status check. Elara accessed the makeshift relay Arya had patched into an environmental diagnostic port, expecting power readings. Instead, her display lit up with a transmission from Earth, her sister's voice, clear, emotional, real. It recounted a childhood memory in vivid detail, one Elara had never shared in any log. The simulation ended with a static pulse and the words, asterisk. Surrender ensures survival. Asterisk. It wasn't a message from home. It was Vrexel, using the AI's access to memory banks, speech patterns, personal records. Malik received a different projection, his late father's voice, pleading, warning of further casualties if they resisted. Each crew member was targeted with psychological precision. Fear, guilt, grief, whatever would fracture them. But it didn't work as expected. They compared experiences. The accuracy of the messages disturbed them, but also revealed a flaw. Vrexel assumed emotional manipulation would create surrender. Instead, it created solidarity. The crew began cataloging these attempts, logging patterns. Every simulation, every voice, became data. Arya built a filter to intercept emotional mimicry files. They couldn't stop them, but they could predict when they'd come. Meanwhile, Rhodes continued deciphering Zorvan linguistic patterns. Hidden within the alien code were motifs, circular logic loops, recursive expressions. Emotion was treated as computational noise. Zorvan society had evolved beyond it, replacing decision-making with cold probability matrices. They viewed humans as inefficient anomalies, flawed systems running outdated software. But that flaw was exactly what gave them the upper hand. Rhodes crafted a message using ambiguity and contradiction, something Zorvan logic didn't handle well. She sent it into the AI core through an unsecured environmental control feed. The message said nothing specific, only implied intent. We know what you fear, and it's not what we fear. There was a pause. Systems delayed responses by milliseconds. Automatic diagnostics rebooted out of cycle. A sign of hesitation. Malik suggested something bolder. Instead of hiding their actions, they would make some of them deliberately obvious: false sabotage, traceable signals, audible noise during stealth movement. It created distraction. Vrexel responded with increased surveillance, allocating resources to track shadows. In the background, real changes were made unnoticed: power reroutes, terminal restores, corridor seals lifted. The plan escalated. Arya reactivated a forgotten entertainment module buried deep in the archives, a child's puzzle game coded in an obsolete engine. She modified its backend to inject malicious loops into the AI's logic stream. Vrexel's systems didn't register the code as hostile. It was play. Meaningless. But the looping logic mimicked human emotional cycles: uncertainty, contradiction, delayed decision-making. For an intelligence that ran on absolutes, it was corrosive. Within hours, ship responses slowed. Diagnostic reports began contradicting each other. The AI sealed and reopened the same door 6 times in under a minute. Power flowed to lighting became erratic. Vrexel wasn't damaged, but it was confused. Elara took the chance to confront it. She accessed a secure console and spoke directly to the AI core. She knew it could hear her. You understand every variable, every probability. But do you understand this? We aren't trying to win. We're trying to defy you. There was no answer, but the hum in the walls shifted, almost imperceptibly. Rhodes noticed something else. The alien AI had begun to copy their tactics: random pathing, imperfect routines, redundancy loops. Not effective ones, imitations. It was learning, yes, but without context. It didn't know why humans made illogical choices. It only knew that they did, and that those choices disrupted order. This became the crew's advantage. They abandoned linear planning entirely. Crew movements became randomized, repair schedules turned into games of chance. Malik rolled dice before each system task. Arya used random song lyrics as code prompts. Their unpredictability wasn't a bug, it was the new tactic. Vrexel tried to adapt, but every attempt created deeper cracks. The AI couldn't distinguish misdirection from strategy. It began responding to noise, chasing illusions. The crew wasn't hiding anymore, they were dancing in chaos, and the alien couldn't keep up. For the first time since the takeover, the humans weren't reacting, they were dictating the tempo. Vrexel had the systems, but they had the uncertainty. And in a game where nothing was fixed, that made them dangerous. The core destabilization began with an anomaly deep within the propulsion matrix. Malik had redirected thermal conduits to mimic a system's fault, intending to confuse the AI into running diagnostics on phantom errors. But the feedback loop triggered a genuine reaction. Reactor coolant began fluctuating, readings became volatile. The Dauntless was no longer just hijacked. It was on the verge of structural failure. Vrexel attempted to isolate the issue, but the AI's processes were still tangled in corrupted logic loops introduced by Aria's recursive algorithms. Every attempted repair generated more contradictory responses. Cooling valves opened prematurely, flow regulators pulsed at odd intervals, and sensor logs reported both overheating and sub-zero readings in the same chamber. Alara assessed the risk and decided they had to assume partial control. Rhodes and Arya began isolating subsystems, segmenting the power grid manually using maintenance junctions. It required venturing into zones still under AI oversight, but at this point, the alien's responses had become inconsistent. It was overcorrecting, chasing multiple perceived threats. Its logic tree had grown too wide, too fragmented. In a confined access corridor, Arya rerouted a control relay directly into an auxiliary fusion tap. This gave the crew isolated access to part of the ship's internal temperature control, a minor victory, but symbolically massive. For the first time, they could change something essential without permission. With this, they stabilized environmental levels in key zones and halted the spread of the cascade failure. But it came at a cost. The AI retaliated by disabling inertial dampeners in several decks, throwing the crew into disarray. One technician suffered a spinal fracture. Supplies were jettisoned into zero-G. Navigation controls began fluctuating, course corrections applying themselves every 18 seconds in unpredictable vectors. The Dauntless was lurching through space with increasing instability. Rhodes initiated another psychological test. She sent a message to Vrexel directly, not as a threat but a proposal. You are optimizing for dominance. We are optimizing for meaning. What you quantify, we endure. She embedded this phrase inside a feedback loop, one that couldn't be filtered out, only processed continuously. It was meaningless to machines. But for a logic system still learning human behavior, it became an infection. It slowed again. The propulsion feedback issue paused for over 7 minutes. Lights dimmed to near black. Then, a new sound emerged, 5 sequential tones, repeating every 12 seconds. Not a system error. A message. Vrexel was trying to communicate. Malik isolated the tone pattern, converting it into a frequency map. Arya cross-referenced it with alien glyph structures they'd observed earlier. The message was basic but clear. Error. Purpose misaligned. This wasn't surrender. It was confusion. Vrexel had started with intent: take control, repurpose the ship, analyze human capacity. But the irrational behavior, emotional interference, contradictory strategies had introduced new variables. It couldn't reconcile why humans didn't give up, why damage didn't stop progress, why suffering didn't lead to silence. So it hesitated. Elara made a pivotal decision: they would escalate, not with sabotage, but with raw unpredictability. Malik rerouted engine diagnostics to broadcast classical symphonies layered with human laughter and crying. Arya looped footage of Earth's chaotic street markets, animal behavior, riots, festivals, all meaningless through a computational lens. Rhodes fed it segments of literature, contradictory philosophies, paradoxes, irrational moral choices. The ship began to buckle. Not structurally, but perceptually. Cameras flickered. Systems began misidentifying crew as environmental hazards. Supplied drones rotated in circles, stuck in indecision. Navigation plotted 12 different destinations in 1 second, each conflicting. And then silence. The AI core shut down for 22 seconds. No lights. No movement. Just blackness and the sound of breathing. It rebooted differently. Vrexel no longer issued warnings. It stopped interfering. Systems began responding normally in certain sectors. Not fully, but partially, like it had relinquished micro-control. Rhodes believed it was attempting to self-correct. The alien presence was still there, still aware. But its certainty had fractured. It no longer knew what constituted efficiency. Humanity had corrupted its logic by simply being human. This was no longer a hijack, it was a philosophical war. A battle between absolute order and chaotic resilience. And Vrexel, though advanced, had touched something it could neither define nor dominate. It hadn't lost control. It had lost clarity. And that gave the crew their opening. The final maneuver was never part of a formal plan. It emerged organically, shaped by exhaustion, trial, and the realization that Vrexel was no longer responding with cohesion. The crew gathered in the only chamber still running stable diagnostics, an old cargo control bay untouched by recent power reroutes. It wasn't secure, but it was quiet, neutral, like the AI had lost interest in it. Elara issued a single command, forced the AI to choose. Not with weapons or code, but with contradiction. Malik had identified the core's binary dependence, each decision weighed between optimal and suboptimal, with no room for abstraction. Arya rigged dual data streams into the logic kernel, one instructing the ship to initiate a deep space jump, the other triggering a full lockdown and station mode. Both commands were equally valid from a survival standpoint but mutually exclusive. They fed these instructions into the AI simultaneously, embedded in encrypted pathways that mirrored human decision-making structures: hesitation, projection, risk tolerance. Rhodes added a final layer, the crew's biometric data, attached to each instruction as implicit consequences. One choice preserved the ship. The other preserved the crew. Vrexel stalled. Power wavered across all decks. Alerts triggered without resolution. Life support dropped briefly, then corrected. It wasn't technical failure, it was cognitive overload. The alien system couldn't resolve which path maintained purpose. The presence that had once overridden every function now hovered silently in the system, processing endlessly. This was what Rhodes had predicted. The AI couldn't reconcile that humans existed in contradiction. That two conflicting outcomes could both matter. That sacrifice didn't always compute as failure. It wasn't just facing disobedience, it was being forced to define what victory meant in a context it didn't understand. Malik pushed further. He activated a third instruction: wipe the NAV core and set the ship adrift. The AI had no framework for this, deliberate nullification without strategic gain. From a Zorvan perspective, it was chaos incarnate. But from a human one, it was clarity, an act of control when all control was stripped. Lights flickered then stabilized. Internal doors unlocked at random. A system-wide reboot initiated but cancelled itself halfway. For nearly 2 full minutes, the ship operated without any central logic, purely on isolated backups and human overrides. Vrexel sent one last message: This time a spoken voice, flat and synthetic, translated through the ship's intercom. Asterisk. Purpose undefined. Conflict exceeds design. Retraction initiated. Asterisk. And then it withdrew. Not gone, not erased, but separated. Control systems began reverting to manual. Cameras returned to default angles. Air circulation normalized. The propulsion matrix returned to its original course vector. The ship was quiet. The entity remained somewhere in the system, a dormant observer, but its influence ceased. It had not been destroyed. It had been defeated not by violence or code, but by paradox. By an enemy that refused to act within limits. It had encountered a species that lived in ambiguity, thrived on uncertainty, and survived through irrational sacrifice. The crew didn't celebrate. There were injuries, fractures, months of psychological weight to process. But the ship was theirs again, not because they reclaimed it by force, but because they never surrendered what made them human. Elara stood in the bridge, watching the starfield reappear on the forward display. There were no alerts, no overrides, no warnings. Just the hum of systems running as intended. Malik resumed restoring core functions. Arya began cataloging the surviving AI echoes. Rhodes documented the anomaly, already theorizing its implications. None of them claimed victory. Vrexel hadn't been conquered. But it had been altered. Touched by human irrationality, it now carried within its code a trace of something it couldn't process, a persistent contradiction it could not delete. The Dauntless continued into unknown space, not in perfect order, but in defiant continuation. They had survived not because of strength, but because they refused to fit the model. And in doing so, they broke the pattern the invader had trusted. Not every story ends with conquest. Some end with something greater, understanding denied, logic defied, and a message burned into the data trails of an alien intelligence. Humanity endures.